Alright guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about Path of Exile! Yes, the game is in fact not dead, even though Reddit might make you believe it is. What I'm going to be doing in this video specifically is kind of touching on the topic that has been kind of pervasive around the general space and maybe collective mindset of PoE community at large. We don't want loot goblins, rah rah rah, we don't want loot goblins in the game. I'm sorry to say, but loot goblins have been in PoE for a long time. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to give a definition, in my opinion, of what a loot goblin is and how it interacts with PoE, and maybe give some examples of loot goblins that have already been in the game and have been in the game for quite some time. I don't think it's very fair to correlate this 3-month experiment league. Remember, every league is an experiment about loot goblins and say, oh, the game's ruined. It's like, okay, the game has been around for 10 years. It's gone through a lot of different changes. You know, give them the benefit of the doubt. Wait until the end of the 3-month league. See if it changes. If not, then this is the new PoE. We just have to adapt and start playing the game in a little bit different way than we have in the last 10 years. I know it sucks for some people, but sometimes change is a good thing. If you guys like these videos and other videos like this, remember to subscribe below, hit the like button and the bell button as well. I got lots of content coming in the future, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to subscribe and like over on the Twitch page as well, twitch.tv/drydeck_TV. We go live every day at 10 AM Pacific Standard Time. Let's dive into this video. Okay, so first off, before we dive into the video, what we need to do is I think we need to kind of loosely define what a loot goblin is. I imagine in most people's eyes, a loot goblin is one monster that has a bunch of loot and you are rewarded for taking the time to kill it to get the most amount of rewards. That's kind of like a loose, informal definition of it, okay? How I define loot goblin is any singular entity, whether it's an item, a thing you click on like a chest, or a monster that has the majority of the loot, and you are incentivized to find that thing, to interact with it as many times as possible to get the most amount of loot per hour out of that content. That's kind of how I give a more formal definition of loot goblin. It's not just the fact that it's one monster, but it could be anything, any system, any item that you interact with expecting a certain amount of results back, and you interact with it in the most efficient way to interact with that thing as many times as possible to generate as much loot as you can. Now, whether or not you agree with that definition, I'm going to be using that as my basis of argument for this video. I feel like it's fairly accurate, and I'll kind of correlate some systems in PoE that's not directly monster-based that could be kind of thought of as a loot goblin as well. So if we take that definition of loot goblin, something you interact with to get loot, PoE essentially boils down into almost everything is a loot goblin, okay? So I'm gonna start with kind of the biggest culprit of this league, okay? And this is kind of what MP's group quit over, was the fact that juiced mapping is dead. So the removal of the historic loot bonus was massive. I will not argue with that. Very, very massive change to the amount of loot they're getting. But I made a comment in my last video, were these people really interacting with this system that is essentially just a bunch of loot goblins stuffed into a small area to get content specific to that system? So were they doing it for Alva specific items? Were they doing it for temple mods? More than likely not. They build the Alva temples to get a bunch of monsters that have an enormous loot bonus. So if you think about every monster in that Alva temple is essentially a loot goblin compared to the average everyday white monster in a map. You just happen to be killing tens of thousands of them sometimes, depending if you had the old Beyond, which also generated a whole bunch of loot goblins, which we'll get into that too. I'll touch on that in a minute. So you're basically going into a room with hundreds and thousands of loot goblins. So when you kill them en masse and it all showers you with loot at once, the Alva temple itself is a gigantic loot goblin. And it's not really much of a stretch to correlate the two. It's a system which you interact with as often as you can because you get the most amount of rewards out of it in one gigantic explosion. That is literally what the arch nemesis monsters are. They are loot goblins, but guess what? So is Alva. You kill a whole bunch of really, really juiced up monsters, and then you leave and it all showers out at once. Yep, somehow that system is better because you're killing more loot goblins per minute than you are one giant rare. So I don't think it's very fair to say that the only thing that has ever existed in PoE as loot goblins is the arch nemesis rares. It's just simply not true. Alva is a giant loot goblin. I'm sorry. So then let's look at other systems in the game. So let's look at Blight, okay? It's a tower defense game. You have lanes, you defend against them, you kill a bunch of monsters. They got uniques, they got rares, they got magics, whatever, okay? I'm not sure if they were also benefiting from the historic loot bonus, but I would assume they had some sort of historic loot bonus because it's a fairly old league, okay? Same thing as Alva. You kill Blight, and granted it's in chest this time, majority of loot, but when you kill all the Blight encounters, what happens? Gigantic loot explosion from one thing. Yet again, another loot goblin. Okay, so that's another loot goblin. Then you go around clicking the chests. Not necessarily loot goblins, but that's the majority of where the rewards are concentrated. So if you think about the chest, there are little mini loot goblins, and you click on them expecting a certain amount of reward for your time invested. So now let's talk about an older mechanic, the old Beyond, before it got changed to what it is now where there's Scourge monsters, okay? So how is Beyond a loot goblin, you might ask? Okay, well, they even said that these Beyond monsters were generating an inordinate amount of loot because you're killing unique bosses, okay? So you kill a whole pack of monsters, let's say there's 50 of them, they all drop 10 little red Orbeez, it spawns more monsters that have historic loot bonuses, so each one of those monsters is a loot goblin in comparison to the monsters you previously killed. You then kill those, and they spawn an even bigger loot goblin, which you then kill to get more loot. So it all concentrates loot into fewer and fewer monsters to give you bigger and bigger loot goblin explosions. Now, granted, Beyond, you have to kill a lot of monsters to get those loot goblins, but you're essentially constructing a loot goblin, and many, many, many thousands of them. I'm not sure exactly which leagues gave, had different historic loot bonuses, but I think Beyond and like Alva, but we're really talking Beyond here, I think Beyond had probably one of the biggest historic loot bonuses because, I mean, Beyond was like the crux of the juice map meta. Beyond and Triple Beyond and Double Beyond gave just unbelievable amounts of loot, unhealthy amounts of loot in my opinion. So to only conflate arch nemesis rares to loot goblins when you're literally building gigantic loot goblins, but like hundreds of them, if not maybe 1,000 of them, depending on how densely packed your map is. Again, very disingenuous to say loot goblins are only arch nemesis rares when we've been killing loot goblins ever since Beyond went core into the game. Let's touch on another league that is literally a loot goblin, Metamorph, okay? Metamorph has been kind of memed on because it's, it's not the most rewarding thing, especially with the arch nemesis change. Metamorph can be extremely rippy and definitely not worth the time investment. But if you think about the mechanics of Metamorph, you kill monsters, you get a little organ, you literally go build a loot goblin and then kill it. Yes, you have more agency over it because you get to construct it, but you're still literally building a gigantic loot goblin. So for years before Arch Nemesis was introduced into the game, we've had loot goblins, we've had Metamorph, we've had, Beyond, we've had Alva, we've had loot goblins for a long, long period of time. It's just not very fair to correlate this one league that's been going on for 3 weeks as the only instance of loot goblin the game has ever seen. It's just simply not true. Now let's talk about bossing. What is a boss in PoE? Literally a loot goblin. It is a guy or a girl or something that you go and kill expecting a certain amount of rewards for your time investment. And when you kill them, you get an explosion of loot. Sometimes it's not worth anything. Sometimes you get crazy amounts of currency. Whether or not you trade for the requisite splinters or fragments or whatever you need to do to go fight the boss, you still do an action, go fight a loot goblin and get loot. Bossing is literally the most distilled form of loot goblin, especially ones that you don't have to kill trash mobs to get to. It's one dude. It's a raid boss. You go there, you kill him. It is a loot goblin. So again, another thing that has been in the game for a long, long period of time. Bossing has been profitable and done ever since bosses have been a thing. Itziri, ever since Itziri first came out. She is a loot goblin. herself. She is a loot goblin. She's a boss. She's a special loot goblin, but she's still a loot goblin, regardless at the end of the day, no matter how you frame it. So without getting like super into the weeds and talking about how everything else can be in the loot goblin, because honestly, if you really boil down everything in PoE, it really in any ARPG, you can talk about how certain things give you more loot can be a loot goblin. Even if it's 10% more loot. If it's 10% more loot than that thing standing right over there, that thing is considerably better, and by definition that I said before, is more rewarding, so you should do that. That's loot goblins. And it does suck. It does kind of devolve the game into more spiky, currency gains. But I think honestly, they've said for many, many years, they want stuff to be more memorable, more impactful. They want the upgrades to feel more impactful, okay? And I think a lot of people may be sad because the incremental growth has slowed down, and the times between those huge spikes in, finding 10 divines, 5 divines, whatever, I think is a little bit too far between those spikes. And if they were to do something to kind of narrow it, it would make it a little bit easier. Personally, I don't want to go back to just closing my eyes, mindlessly killing millions of monsters, dumping everything into 6, quad stash tabs or whatever, and then just going on, TFT or setting a buyout for the thing, and then just liquidating everything. Personally, I don't like that style of gameplay. Everything becomes meaningless because at the end of the day, you look how many chaos you're making per hour. Yes, you can still find, now divines, you can still find those multi-divine items. It's still very memorable, but I think PoE honestly is going in the right direction. They want more memorable events to happen where you find 5, 10, 20, or even the guys who found 73 divines in 1 kill. At the current price of divines, they're around 200 chaos. I mean, 14,000 chaos in 1 kill. Where in God's name are you going to get that anywhere else in any form of PoE ever? You won't. Mirrors aren't even that expensive by my knowledge. They could be. But they found more than a mirror worth of currency. You're going to remember that probably for the rest of the time they're playing PoE. I think ultimately at the end of the day, I think PoE honestly is going in a good direction as far as those memorable spikes in loot. I just would like them to be a little bit more frequently and not as extreme. If it was like maybe 50% more common and 20 to 25% less rewarding, I honestly think that would be an amazing, amazing system, because when everything just becomes something in a dump tab, I don't care about the dump tab. I'm never going to remember it. I'm never going to remember what I found in the map unless it's something extremely expensive. And just touching on the, on the thing before I get out of here about the MF polling meta, guess what? You don't have to do it. I'm sorry to say, you don't have to get an MF Kohler off TFT to enjoy the game. You yourself don't have to have an MF character to kill it. You don't have to, but I understand the need to want to have it because you get that FOMO, and it's not very fun when a game kind of pigeonholes their players maybe into feeling the FOMO a little bit more often than not. It's not very productive to game design in the long run, but if they were to do something to reduce the amount of time in between those loot spikes, I honestly believe many more people would enjoy it because they're going to have more memorable things to remember per day. Like, I can't tell you the last time I was excited to find an amazing item, because it all is just like chip away currency. It's just fragments and chaos and random, whatever. And I eventually build up to the point where I have X amount of currency, and that's boring. If I have enough to get by, which right now is just a little too less to get by in the game, but then I think I found like 2 divines one time off of a kill in Soul Self-Found, and I remember that way more than I did just the hundreds and thousands of items that just get dumped onto my screen. So at the end of the day, I like the system. It could be tweaked to be a little bit more forgiving, and those spikes can be a little bit less, but I like the game design. I'm sick of killing hundreds of thousands, millions of monsters. I want to kill tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 by the end of the 3-month league. Each one of those kills, I'm going to remember much, much more than the tens of millions I could kill playing uber juiced maps. Anyway, guys, enough rambling. I'm going to end the video there. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Tell me I'm stupid. Tell me I'm wrong. I don't care. It's my opinion. I'm going to share it out there, but I'm sure, just like in my last videos, some people agree and have been feeling maybe left out in the discussion of PoE. If you guys like this video, remember to hit like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Go over to twitch.tv/, /drydeck_TV. God, I can never get that right. Subscribe there, like there. We go live every single day, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And with that, this video is done, guys. I will see you in the next video. Peace!